It was a dark, stormy night in 1869 when Abraham Kuyper, a young and fiery preacher, stood before a crowded church in the Netherlands. His voice thundered through the hall, echoing the fury of the storm outside. Uniformity, he declared, is the curse of modern life. The congregation, stunned by his bold words, leaned in, eager to hear more. Kuyper was not just any preacher. He was a man on a mission to shake the foundations of the church and society. Kuyper believed that the church, like the world around it, was rich with diversity. He saw this diversity as a gift from God. But the church, he argued, had become a place of uniformity where everyone was expected to think, act, and believe the same way. This, he believed, was not only unnatural, but also dangerous. It stifled the spirit and suppressed the unique gifts that each person brought to the community. Kuyper's ideas were not new. He was influenced by German thinkers like Friedrich Schleiermacher, who argued that true unity in the church came from its pluriformity, its many forms and expressions. Schleiermacher believed that the church should be a place where different voices could be heard and different ideas could flourish. Kuyper took this idea and ran with it, applying it to the Dutch church and society. In his early career, Kuyper saw the church as a place that needed reform. He gave powerful sermons in Utrecht and Amsterdam, calling for a new way of thinking about the church. He spoke of the ruins of the once so splendid church of our fathers and urged his listeners to rebuild or move out. He praised the free churches in North America, where like-minded people could come together voluntarily without the constraints of a rigid uniform structure. Kuyper's vision was not just about the church. He saw the world around him changing rapidly. The second half of the 19th century was a time of great intellectual and social diversification. People were specializing in different fields, and new ideas were spreading like wildfire. Kuyper recognized that the old ways of doing things, including the way the church was organized, were no longer working. He believed that the only way to move forward was to embrace this diversity and allow the church to take on many different forms. This was a radical idea, and it did not go down well with everyone. Roman Catholic contemporaries criticized Kuyper fiercely, arguing that his ideas would lead to chaos and division. But Kuyper was undeterred. He believed that the church should reflect the world around it, and that meant accepting and celebrating the differences among its members. Kuyper's ideas were not just theoretical. He put them into practice by helping to establish new churches outside the traditional structures of the Dutch Reformed Church. These churches were free to determine their own form and beliefs, and they became a powerful force for change in Dutch society. Kuyper's commitment to pluriformity was not just about the church. It was a response to the changing times. He saw the world becoming more complex and diverse, and he believed that the church should be at the forefront of this change. He argued that the sovereignty of God, the root principle of the Calvinistic worldview, should guide all aspects of life, including politics and society. This meant that the state, society, and the church should all be organized in a way that reflected God's sovereignty and the diversity of human life. Kuyper's ideas were revolutionary, and they continue to influence how we think about the church and society today. His call for pluriformity and freedom in the church was a challenge to the status quo, and it remains a powerful reminder that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. As Kuyper once said, "I exalt multiformity and hail in it a higher stage of development." His words still resonate, reminding us that the richness of life comes from the many different voices and perspectives that make up our world. Abraham Kuyper, a prominent Dutch theologian and politician, had a complex relationship with the concept of democracy. His views were shaped by his deep religious beliefs, particularly his emphasis on the sovereignty of God. This meant that Kuyper believed that God, not humans, should be the ultimate authority in society. However, he also recognized that the term democratic did not necessarily have negative connotations, especially when it came to the history of Calvinism. In 1890, Kuyper wrote a series of articles in a newspaper called The Standard, where he addressed the accusations made by his political opponents. These opponents, who were from liberal and conservative groups, claimed that Kuyper's anti-revolutionary party, ARP, was too democratic. Kuyper clarified that when the ARP supported democracy, it did not mean they wanted to eliminate class distinctions or allow the general population to make their own laws without any oversight. He argued that such ideas would be a form of human sovereignty, which would replace God's authority. According to Kuyper, true democracy should not undermine the sovereignty of God. Kuyper also believed that a democratic form of government was just as good as any other, as long as it recognized God's sovereignty. He used the term democratic to protest against the idea that only the wealthy should have the power to make decisions for everyone else. Instead, he argued that no part of the population should be excluded from participating in government. However, Kuyper's stance on democracy was not entirely clear, and some scholars like Dirk Kuyper have suggested that Kuyper had theocratic leanings. Kuyper argued that Kuyper's support for democracy was driven by his desire to see Christians gain enough power to re-Christianize society. Kuyper, however, rejected the idea of theocracy, which is the belief that God should rule directly through a religious leader. He believed that while all aspects of society should follow God's laws, the government should not be a theocracy. This ambiguity in Kuyper's views on democracy was partly due to the influence of conservative members of the ARP, who were wary of the potential consequences of further democratization in Dutch society. These conservatives, led by Lohman, were opposed to expanding voting rights and eventually left the party in 1894. To maintain unity after the split, Kuyper deliberately avoided taking a strong stance on political democracy. In his lectures at Princeton, Kuyper discussed two main theories of sovereignty that he saw as opposing the Calvinist view: popular sovereignty and state sovereignty. Popular sovereignty, associated with the French Revolution, held that the people as a collective were the ultimate source of authority. Kuyper saw this as a form of atheism because it placed human authority above God's. He argued that the French Revolution, unlike the Calvinist revolutions in the Netherlands, England, and America, had rejected God's sovereignty. Kuyper's criticism of popular sovereignty was rooted in his opposition to individualism, which he believed was the foundation of the French Revolution. He saw individualism as destructive to the organic structure of society, leading to a focus on personal gain rather than the common good. This individualism, he argued, had contributed to social and economic problems in Europe, such as class, conflict, and material inequality. On the other hand, state sovereignty, influenced by German philosophers like Hegel, held that the state itself was the ultimate authority. Kuyper rejected this idea because it treated the state as a mystical entity with its own will, which could then claim to be the source of all morality and justice. He saw this as a form of pantheism, where the state was elevated to the status of a god. Kuyper believed that this kind of state absolutism was a threat to civil liberties and could lead to a form of socialism where the state controlled all aspects of life. Kuyper's critique of both popular sovereignty and state sovereignty was part of his broader argument that Calvinism provided a better foundation for society. He believed that recognizing God's sovereignty could lead to a balanced and just society where the state, the people, and other social institutions all played their proper roles. Kuyper's goal was to show that Calvinism could offer a practical and relevant solution to the political challenges of the modern world. Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch statesman and theologian, had some big ideas about how society should work. One of his most important ideas was called sphere sovereignty. This means that different parts of society, like families, businesses, schools, and churches have their own special roles and rules. These parts don't get their authority from the government but from God, and they are responsible to God for how they operate. Kuyper believed that each part of society grows naturally, just like a plant grows from a seed. For example, families form because God created men and women to be together and have children. These families then grow into larger communities, and the relationships between people become more complex. This natural growth is what Kuyper called the organic nature of society. Kuyper was reacting to some popular ideas of his time. Some people thought society was like a machine, where everything works according to strict rules and causes and effects. Kuyper disagreed. He thought society should be seen as a living moral organism where different groups of people share common beliefs and values. This idea was important when he helped start the Free University, which was based on specific Christian principles. Kuyper believed that different groups in society, like Catholics, Protestants, and humanists, should be free to organize their own institutions, like schools and political parties. This idea of different groups living side by side with their own beliefs and institutions is called verzuiling in Dutch, which means pillarization. It was a way to ensure that everyone could live according to their own values without forcing others to do the same. While Kuyper saw a society as organic and naturally growing, he saw the government as more like a machine. The government's job is to keep things running smoothly and to make sure everyone respects each other's boundaries. For example, if a business tries to take over a school's role, the government should step in to keep them separate. Even though the government has these important roles, it is just one part of society, not the boss of everything. Kuyper thought the government should be limited in its power and work with other parts of society to keep things in balance. When Kuyper talked about sphere sovereignty, he was saying that different parts of society should be free to operate independently. This idea was very important when he helped start the Free University, which was meant to be free from government and church control. Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty also helped create verzuiling in Dutch society. Verzuiling meant that different groups, like Catholics, Protestants, and Socialists, could set up their own schools, trade unions, and political parties. This allowed people to live and work according to their own beliefs, without interfering with others. However, some people, like Herman Doy Weird, pointed out that Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty could be confusing. Kuyper sometimes used the word sphere to mean different things, like a natural part of society or a group of people with the same beliefs. This confusion might have made it easier for verzuiling to develop, even though Kuyper's original idea was about the natural order of society. Kuyper also had strong ideas about the relationship between the church and the state. He believed that the church should be free from government control, just like other parts of society. This was important because in the past, the government sometimes tried to control the church, which Kuyper thought was wrong. Kuyper argued that the church and the state are separate but equal. Both are accountable to God and should respect each other's roles. The government should not try to make religious laws, and the church should not try to run the government. This idea of a free church in a free state was a key part of Kuyper's thinking. Kuyper also believed that the government should acknowledge God's authority and govern according to God's principles. However, the government should not force people to follow a particular religion. Instead, it should tolerate different religious groups and protect their freedom to practice their beliefs. Kuyper's ideas about the church and the state were influenced by his deep faith and his desire to create a society where everyone could live according to their own beliefs. His concept of sphere sovereignty and the idea of a free church in a free state helped shape Dutch society and continue to influence how people think about the relationship between different parts of society today. Abraham Kuyper, a prominent Dutch theologian and politician, found himself in the middle of a heated debate about the role of the government in relation to the church. The crux of the argument revolved around Article 36 of the Belgic Confession, a key document for many Dutch Protestants. This article stated that the government had the right to protect the sacred ministry and to remove and prevent all idolatry and false worship. Kuyper, however, believed that this article was outdated and should be revised or removed. Kuyper's stance on this issue was not just a matter of theological debate. It was deeply intertwined with the political landscape of the Netherlands in the late 19th century. At the time, the country was experiencing significant social and political changes. The Enlightenment had brought about a shift in how people viewed the role of government and the relationship between church and state. Many people, including Kuyper, were trying to find a balance between traditional religious values and the new liberal ideas that were gaining ground. One of Kuyper's main opponents in this debate was his former colleague, Guillaume Hoedemaker. Hoedemaker held a more traditional view, believing that the government should be closely aligned with the national church and should have the authority to enforce religious standards. He argued that the government should recognize the church as a divine institution, and that the only way to determine if a state was truly Christian was to see if it granted the church a public and legal status. Kuyper, on the other hand, believed that the government should not be in the position to judge which church was the true church. He thought that the government should focus on the natural knowledge of God, which was accessible to everyone, rather than trying to interpret God's revealed will as found in the Scriptures. This was a significant shift from his earlier views, where he had agreed with Hoedemaker that the government should be guided by God's revealed will. Kuyper's change in position was influenced by the practical realities of the time. He recognized that the liberal political environment of the Netherlands made it difficult for the government to act according to specific religious doctrines. Instead, he proposed that government officials should seek to understand God's will through their own consciences rather than being directed by any particular church. This nuanced approach allowed Kuyper to advocate for the freedom of churches and Christian organizations within a liberal state. He believed that the government should protect the rights of individuals and institutions to practice their faith without interference, but it should not be responsible for determining the validity of different religious beliefs. Kuyper's ideas were not just theoretical. They had real-world implications. His political party, the Anti-Revolutionary Party, ARP, formally abandoned Article 36, recognizing it as an outdated concept that no longer fit the modern context. This move was part of a broader effort to create a society where different religious and ideological groups could coexist peacefully. Kuyper's concept of sphere sovereignty was central to this vision. He believed that society was made up of various spheres, such as the family, the church, and the state, each with its own distinct role and authority. This idea of pluralism allowed for the coexistence of different groups without one sphere dominating the others. It was a way to ensure that the diverse population of the Netherlands could live together harmoniously, each contributing to the common good in their own way. Kuyper's ideas on the relationship between church and state and his broader vision of a pluralistic society were shaped by the challenges of his time. He sought to navigate the tension between traditional religious values and the modern liberal state, advocating for a balanced approach that respected both the autonomy of individuals and the importance of religious institution. His legacy continues to influence discussions about the role of religion in public life, both in the Netherlands and beyond. Kuyper saw science as a way to fight against agnosticism, a belief that we can't know the deeper truths about the universe. Agnosticism, named by Thomas Henry Huxley in 1869, said that science can only tell us about what we can see and touch, the observable phenomena. But there are deeper, hidden truths, or noumena, that science can't reach. People like Herbert Spencer and John Fiske talked about a mysterious force or power behind the universe, but they believed we could never truly understand it. Kuyper didn't agree. He thought that humans naturally want to understand the big questions about where we come from, how everything is connected, and where we're going. He saw this in the way that evolution theory spread quickly across all areas of science, not just biology. Even scientists who were agnostics couldn't stop themselves from trying to understand the deeper meaning of the universe. Kuyper believed that science should include the study of spiritual and metaphysical things like theology, and that these areas were just as important as the physical sciences. He and his friend Hodge argued that these spiritual sciences were part of true science and should be studied rigorously. Kuyper also believed that Calvinism, the branch of Christianity he followed, encouraged a love for science. He used the story of the Siege of Leiden in the Netherlands to illustrate this. During the war between Spain and the Netherlands, the city of Leiden was under siege. The people of Leiden were so brave and loyal that after they won, they were given a university instead of money or honors. This university became a center for great scientists and helped the Netherlands become a leader in science. Kuyper saw this as a sign that Calvinism fostered a love for science. Kuyper also used the Calvinist belief in God's decrees to explain why Calvinists loved science. According to this belief, God has a plan for everything, and the universe is not random. This idea of order and stability is essential for science, which relies on the idea that the universe follows consistent laws. Kuyper argued that even scientists who didn't believe in God still saw the universe as ordered and stable, which supported his idea that Calvinism was at the heart of modern science. Kuyper believed that everyone, not just professional scientists, should love and pursue science. He wrote in his newspaper De Standard that true Calvinists should be enthusiastic about science because it helps us understand God's creation. He encouraged his followers to support the Free University where they could get the education needed to become leaders in science and other fields. He wanted well-educated Calvinists to help interpret the world for those who couldn't get a higher education. Kuyper also believed that Calvinism restored science to its proper place. He said that in the past, people focused too much on spiritual things and neglected the physical world. Calvinism, he argued, taught that Christ's redemption wasn't just for souls, but for the entire universe. This meant that studying nature and the physical world was important and valuable. Calvinism also taught that God's grace is available to everyone, not just believers. This meant that even non-Christians could make important scientific discoveries and contribute to our understanding of the world. Kuyper explained that the fall of humanity, according to Christian belief, affected our ability to understand the universe. But God's common grace, which is available to everyone, helps us regain some of that understanding. This is why great thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Darwin could make significant contributions to science, even though they weren't believers. Kuyper believed that, through science, we can see the beauty and order of God's creation, even if we don't fully understand it. Kuyper's ideas about science and faith were deeply rooted in the teachings of John Calvin, a key figure in the Protestant Reformation. Calvin believed that sin had corrupted every part of human life, including the way people think. This meant that human reason, or the ability to think and understand, was damaged by sin. However, Calvin also believed that God had given gifts to everyone, even those who didn't believe in him. These gifts included the ability to study and understand things like law, philosophy, and science. Calvin's view was different from the medieval scholars who thought that human reason was still good enough to understand the world. Calvin argued that without God's help, human reason was blind or extinguished, but he didn't completely reject the work of non-Christians. He admired the achievements of ancient thinkers and believed that these achievements were possible because God had given them gifts. Calvin saw these gifts as a form of God's common grace, which is God's kindness to all people, not just believers. Kuyper took Calvin's ideas and developed them further. He believed that God's common grace allowed non-Christians to make valuable contributions to science and other fields. However, Kuyper also saw a problem. If science was completely separate from faith, it could become distorted. He argued that science should be based on Christian principles which would help it see the world more clearly. This was important because Kuyper believed that the world was in a fallen state, meaning it was not as God intended it to be. Non-Christians, on the other hand, often saw the world as naturally good and evolving on its own. Kuyper's idea of sphere sovereignty was central to his thinking. He believed that different areas of life, like science, the church, and the government, should be independent from each other. This meant that the church shouldn't control science, and the government shouldn't control the church. Kuyper used this idea to argue for the creation of the Free University in Amsterdam, which would be free from both church and state control. He believed that this would allow science to develop according to its own principles, free from outside interference. Kuyper also saw a conflict in science between those who believed the world was fallen, like Christians, and those who believed it was naturally good, like non-Christians. He called the first group abnormalists, and the second group normalists. The abnormalists believed that the world needed to be restored through God's grace, while the normalists believed that the world was improving on its own. Kuyper thought that this conflict was inevitable, and that the only way to resolve it was to have different scientific communities based on different beliefs. He believed that Christians should develop their own scientific theories and institutions, free from the influence of non-Christian ideas. Kuyper's ideas had a big impact on how Christians thought about science. He argued that science was not neutral, but was always based on certain beliefs or presuppositions. This meant that Christians should not just accept scientific ideas without thinking about the beliefs behind them. Instead, they should develop their own scientific theories that were based on Christian principles. Kuyper's ideas also influenced the development of Verzeling in the Netherlands, which was a system where different religious and ideological groups had their own separate institutions, like schools and universities. Kuyper believed that this was necessary to allow different groups to develop their own ideas and values without interference from others. He saw this as a way to ensure that science and other fields could flourish while respecting the different beliefs of people in society. Kuyper's vision of science and faith was about creating a world where different groups could coexist and contribute to society in their own way, without one group dominating the others. This was a key part of his broader vision for a society where everyone could live according to their own beliefs, while still working together for the common good. Kuyper saw the conflict in science as a battle not between science and religion, but between two types of science, Christian and non-Christian. This idea was a response to the challenges facing Christianity in the late 1800s, especially the rise of modern science and the Enlightenment. To understand Kuyper's view, we need to look at the context of his time and compare it with the perspective of his contemporary, B.B. Warfield, a theologian at Princeton. Warfield believes that science was a unified and objective field where both Christian and non-Christian scientists worked together to build a single shared body of knowledge. He thought that while Christian scientists might produce better results, they were still part of the same scientific community. Warfield saw no fundamental difference between the two types of scientists. They were just working on the same task, but some were doing it better. Kuyper, on the other hand, had a very different view. He believed that the Enlightenment and the revolutions that followed had led to a secularization of intellectual and cultural life. This secularization was characterized by unbelief and was in direct opposition to the Calvinist worldview, which emphasized God's sovereignty. Kuyper saw a fundamental antithesis between these two worldviews. For him, the way scientists approached their work was deeply influenced by their underlying beliefs. Christian scientists, he argued, would build a different kind of science, one that was rooted in a Christian understanding of the world. In the United States, the situation was different. American evangelicals, including those at Princeton, had a more positive view of the Enlightenment. They saw the American Revolution as a product of the moderate Enlightenment which valued reason and scientific thought. This led to a synthesis of modern scientific ideas, the principles of the American Revolution, and evangelical Christianity. American evangelicals believed that science and Christianity were allies, and that scientific discoveries could support religious beliefs. For example, they saw the laws of nature as evidence of God's design. However, this relationship was challenged by the scientific revolution associated with Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin's theory of evolution presented a naturalistic explanation for the diversity of life, which seemed to contradict the idea of a divine creator. This led to a growing separation between science and religion, and by the early 1900s, science had become largely secular in American academia. Kuyper's response to this was to argue for a twofold division in science. He believed that Christians should develop their own kind of science within independent institutions. This was an attempt to provide a counter to the secular, modernistic worldview. Kuyper's goal was to show that Calvinism could offer a dynamic and relevant approach to modern society. However, this idea did not resonate with Warfield and his followers, leading to a divergence in American evangelical thought that continues to this day. Kuyper used military imagery to describe the conflict in science, reflecting the intense debates of his time. He argued that the real conflict was not between science and religion, but between Christian and non-Christian science. This was a way to shift the focus of the debate and encourage Christians to engage in scientific work from a distinctly Christian perspective. Kuyper's approach was a response to the growing secularization of the university, where he saw normalists, non-Christians, pushing out abnormalists, Christians, from academic positions. By framing the conflict this way, Kuyper hoped to remove the obstacle that the perceived conflict between science and faith posed for devout Christians. He wanted to show that Christians could and should be involved in science, but from a Christian worldview. This was important for Kuyper's goal of developing a specifically Christian approach to science, which he believed could transform modern society. Abraham Kuyper was a man of many talents and passions, but his heart was deeply rooted in his faith. He believed that everything from politics to science should be viewed through the lens of his Christian beliefs. However, when it came to art, Kuyper was somewhat of an outsider. He didn't create art himself, and sometimes he even showed a bit of hostility towards certain forms of it, especially drama. Despite this, his ideas about art have had a lasting impact, especially in the way people think and talk about it. Kuyper saw art as more than just pretty pictures or entertaining stories. For him, art was a way to express deep religious feelings and ideas. He believed that art, like science, was a gift from God, and that it could help people connect with the divine. This is why he took art seriously, even though he wasn't an artist himself. He gave lectures on aesthetics and the history of Dutch literature, and he wrote about the relationship between theology and the arts. His goal was to show how art could be a powerful tool for spreading Christian values and ideas. One of the things Kuyper noticed was that art was becoming more popular among ordinary people. In the late 1800s, new technologies, like the gramophone, made it easier for people to enjoy music and other forms of art. This was a big change from the past, when only the wealthy could afford to attend concerts or buy paintings. Kuyper saw this as both a good and a bad thing. On one hand, he thought it was great that more people could enjoy art and find beauty in their lives. On the other hand, he worried that this popularity might lead to a lot of mediocre art that didn't really have much value. Kuyper believed that the rise of materialism and rationalism in society was making people's lives too cold and unfeeling. He thought that art could help bring warmth and emotion back into people's lives. He saw art as a kind of new religion that could fill the spiritual void left by the focus on money and intellect. This is why he thought it was important to talk about art in his lectures, even though he wasn't an artist himself. Kuyper's ideas about art were shaped by his broader worldview. He believed in the importance of sphere sovereignty, which means that different areas of life like art, science, and politics should have their own freedom and autonomy. He also believed in the antithesis, the idea that there is a fundamental conflict between Christian and non-Christian ways of thinking. For Kuyper, art was not just about beauty. It was also about this conflict. He wanted to show that Christian art could be just as powerful and important as any other kind of art. In the end, Kuyper's legacy in the world of art is not so much about the art itself, but about how people think about it. He helped people see that art is not just for entertainment. It can also be a way to explore deep religious and philosophical ideas. His ideas about art, like his ideas about science and politics, were part of his larger vision for a world where Christian values could shape every aspect of life. Even though he wasn't an artist, Kuyper's influence on how people think about art has lasted for generations.